I'm currently in year 2 since starting my rug tufting small business, but best believe I definitely learned some things along the way. Hello, my name is Kayleigh and I have a small business called Creations by Kayleigh where I make and sell handmade tufted rugs. And in today's video, I'm going to be telling you things I've learned in my 2 years of rug tufting. So without further ado, let's get started. The very first thing I learned is use a tufting fabric that works for you. In the beginning stages of tufting, I was trying out different kinds of tufting fabric just so I can find what works for me. I tried monk's cloth, which is also known as primary tufting fabric, and in that process of me using monk's cloth, I found it really hard to work with, making the tufting process pretty difficult. And not to mention, it's pretty pricey and the cloth isn't sold in stores, making it pretty hard to get your hands on, especially if you're really in desperate need of it. So with monk's cloth being a complete fail, I did some more research and I came across burlap. And after trying it out once, I knew this tufting fabric was the one for me. It's easy to work with, it's sold in stores like Walmart, Hobby Lobby, Joann Fabrics, and I think Michael's. It's inexpensive and overall, I highly recommend using burlap. But if it's not your cup of tea, that's completely fine as well. The point I'm making is make sure to find a tufting fabric that works for you and one that you feel comfortable purchasing. But always remember, there's going to be some trial and error when trying to find a tufting fabric that works for you. But remember, that's all a part of the process. The next thing I learned is there is nothing wrong with purchasing a tufting gun from Amazon. Tufting guns are pretty pricey as it is, and if you're first starting out and really new to tufting, I recommend purchasing a tufting gun from Amazon just so you don't dive headfirst into purchasing a really expensive one, especially if you're new to tufting. My first ever tufting gun I purchased was from Amazon, and it lasted for about a year and I made a good amount of rugs in that process. Then eventually, when I was ready and more skilled, I upgraded to a more expensive tufting gun. But make sure in the process before buying any tufting gun, you should do your research, read reviews, and all that kind of stuff, and you'll be good to go. Being that we're on the discussion of tufting, the next thing I learned is make sure to tuft the outline first. Tufting the outline first and then filling it in is the easiest way of tufting in my opinion. It's easy because once the outlining is done, all you can do next is just fill in the empty spaces, which in my opinion is really satisfying and a really therapeutic process. Which brings us to the next thing I learned, which is when tufting, tuft in the same direction consistently. It's important when tufting that you stick with a direction and do that during the remainder of your tufting process. When tufting, I tuft vertically, keeping it consistent the whole time. But the only time I change my direction is when I get to a spot that doesn't really allow me to tuft vertically, so I'll just tuft horizontally, really making sure to fill that space in completely. Also, it's pretty satisfying seeing your tufting stitches go all the same way. The next thing I learned is, when tufting, don't overlap your stitches. In the beginning, when I first started making rugs, I discovered that I can play around with the density and explore that by putting my tufting stitches close together. I remember working on a rug and the process was finished and the rug density was to my liking when I realized a certain section of the rug was really rough, really making it hard to level it down. Until I realized I put my stitches basically on top of each other and the density was really wonky in that one section. When I tuft, I like tufting to a point that it looks full and soft, and I achieve that look by putting the tufting stitches close to each other, but not literally on top of each other. So just try to stay consistent with your tufting stitches just so you don't end up tufting on top of already tufted stitches. Okay, the next thing I'm going to say is probably one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever experienced in my 2 years of tufting. The next thing I learned is carving in between tufting can either make or break your project, literally. When I first started tufting, I would see people carving sections of their rug in between tufting while it was still on the frame, which I soon learned it helps speeds up the carving process. So one day while tufting a rug, I was on the last section of my rug, almost completing the process until I decided to try that technique. And I would very soon regret making that decision because I ended up slicing my carving shears into my fabric, ruining the entire rug. In my opinion, I recommend not using that technique because one wrong move and your entire rug is ruined. You can also do it with scissors as well, but I also did it and I ended up cutting my fabric accidentally. But if you want to try it, you can try it. That is up to you. But in my personal opinion, I will not be using that technique. And I would not recommend using that technique for people who are new to tufting. Now that we moved on to the next step, let's talk about backing. The next thing I learned is to make sure you do your research on the kind of carpet adhesive you want to use. Ever since I started tufting, I have always used Robert's 3095 carpet adhesive. When it comes to Robert's 3095, when you apply it, it will be wet, but when you leave it out to dry for about a day, it becomes tacky. The tackiness of the adhesive also helps when it comes to shipping because it makes your rug flexible and not stiff. Also, when you use Robert's 3095 on your tufted pieces, you really need to specify in your care card instructions that they should not be put in the washer machine nor dryer. I say that because when you use Robert's 3095 on your tufted products, if that carpet adhesive ever comes in contact with water, it will break down the adhesive, leaving your rug completely destroyed. I recommend watching a video from Sam Made That here on YouTube where Sam does an experiment putting tufted products in the washer and you get to see the outcome. If you're interested in watching that video, I will link it down in the description box below. Okay, now that we moved on to backing, the next thing I learned is do what backing technique works for you. There are many ways to back your tufted products, but at the end of the day, stick to a technique you like doing and stick to products you like using. I prefer using non-slip backing fabric instead of just felt backing, and I also prefer using twill tape on the edges of my tufted pieces just to give them a finished and cleaned look. If someone uses a certain technique or add more steps to their backing process, it is not an end-all be-all if you choose not to do it or if it just doesn't work for you. I had to learn this in the beginning stages of my tufting journey, but eventually I ended up finding things that work for me, works for my customers, and overall works for my small business. Now that we are on the last step, which is detailing, the next thing I learned is using a lint remover on your tufted pieces is a game changer. I use a lint remover before and after I start my detailing process for my tufted products, and it's honestly a lifesaver. When I use this lint remover, it always helps get the lint and the fibers out, making sure everything is smooth and easy to work with when I'm ready to level or carve my tufted piece. And once I'm done with my leveling and carving, I always do one more pass of the lint remover just to remove the fibers and to move around the yarn strands to see if I need to go back in and carve or level once more. When using the lint remover, the finished product is always soft to the touch and fluffy, which is always my main objective for my tufted pieces. I highly recommend you looking into purchasing a lint remover because it's an absolute game changer. The next thing I learned is use tweezers to move the yarn strands in the correct place before carving. I make sure to do this before I start my carving process just to make sure all the yarn strands are in their designated color group. And yes, moving the yarn strands around does take some time and some may think it's probably unnecessary, but for me personally, it helps me out when I'm carving and it makes the finished outcome look nice and neat seeing the yarn strands in the correct spaces. Now that we moved on to carving, the next thing I learned is carving takes time to learn, especially if you're a perfectionist. Carving was a thing I really struggled in when I first started my tufting journey. Mostly because I really wanted to go for that 3D look and I wasn't able to achieve that look because I was new to tufting and I was still learning the ropes on how to carve. But finally, with some trial and error and practice, I was finally able to achieve that look. I've been currently going through all of my tufted products and going in and carving them again because in the beginning stages of me making those pieces, I thought I achieved the 3D effect, which really, when I look back at them now, I definitely did not achieve the look I was going for. I say all that to say, carving takes time, practice, and some trial and error. But once you get the hang of it and your carving skills are to your liking, the end result of your tufted pieces are going to be extremely rewarding, making the time you spent carving so worth it. Which brings us to the last thing I've learned in my 2 years of rug tufting, which is knowing the worth of your creations. As you can see in this video, creating tufted pieces take a while to make, and there is a lot of steps that go into rug tufting. And I realized that I should not downplay the time I spend making my tufted products. And I should not downplay the worth of my tufted products. So if you made it to the end of this video, I want you to know that your creations have value and worth, and don't think otherwise. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I did not touch on all the things I've learned because this video would be like 10 hours long, but I do hope the things I did mention in this video helped you out a bit and made you learn some things as well. I hope you liked today's video, and I'll see you next time.